Welcome back to another recording of the Israel Connection, a live session where we unpack current events in Israel and focus on major events as part of a conversation. My name is Dean Baghdadi, and I'm the senior Shaliach at Pozez JCC. Let's begin.
So there's a lot to cover regarding that question. How can I be involved in Israel but yet promote the stuff that I believe in? And this is definitely a conversation we'll have here. Specifically this week, I wanted to focus obviously on what's happening and cover some of that, but also try and shed light on two other very interesting things that happened this week. So without further ado, we'll start today's update. I think we have everyone online. Months of tension led to the passing of the reasonableness bill, the one that we've all been aware of that happened last Monday. That was the final vote, the third vote for this ruling, which of course is eliminating one of the arguments Supreme Courts can have regarding to criticize and monitor the work of the government and ministers, essentially breaking down the arguments of the content itself of the vote, of the idea of the bill that has been passed, and focuses more on the procedure or the way it has been passed. With 64-0 voting, which again is very unprecedented, and it is one of the most rarest thing we've seen. With the opposition boycotting the voting after a compromise has not been reached when trying even to push for a compromise seconds before the voting has started, and mid-voting, we've still seen some arguments and discussions between opposition and coalition members trying to mediate, with eventually passing the bill as it is. And referring to some of the sayings that members of the parliament said before that they would try to compromise, they would try to soften the bill and create a more kind of like mediate version of it, eventually passes on the harder version of it, which also limits the ability of the Supreme Court to criticize a decision to not make a decision made by the government, when specifically referring to establishing the committee that will eventually elect judges. And by doing so, also create the unprecedented procedure of inability of the Supreme Court to tell a ministry that it is refusing to do their job. Now, this is very, very complicated. I know this is very legal, weird stuff, but also on a logical basis, this is very disconcerting. Obviously, the passing of the bill was followed by and caused even more protests on the streets that we've seen in the past week. Major, huge protests everywhere from the weekend before to the week after, following hundreds of thousands of people protesting on the streets of Israel in hundreds of locations. Against not the bill itself, but the way it passes, the fact that it passed without mediation, without broader agreement, although there is a very broad agreement in the public. More than 70% of the public in Israel agrees that a certain reform needs to be passed. The judicial system in Israel needs fixes, it needs reforms, it needs correction, but it has to be done in a broader agreement and not one-sided. Majority of people don't believe that one-sided is this reform is the solution, and yet still we've seen this bill passes with like 64-0. Not a single member of the coalition has opposed the reform, although a lot of them went forward after the bill has passed, talking to media, saying that they are concerned about this one, that they regret voting for it. That doesn't change the fact that all of them voted for it. Not a single member voted against it, although a lot of them believe that a broader agreement should have made this one so much easier within the public. Now, on the opposition side, we've seen kind of like flipping between Gantz and Lapid, both of them leaders of the opposition, agreeing and disagreeing for a compromise. And I'll say followed by unsuccessful events in the past of both of them trusting Netanyahu's government, led to reduce of their size in the public and their views in the public. They're all being led astray. It does not surprise that eventually they didn't reach a compromise. You can blame each side for the lack of compromise eventually held, but it seems like all led to this moment we've seen on Monday, and then of course followed by protests. And I didn't want to focus on the reasonableness bill itself because I know we've talked a lot about it in the passing weeks, and I wanted to focus, just like the JCRC session, on what's next. I wanted to focus on three headlines from last week, some of them more relevant, some of them less relevant, but it focused on three different agenda items regarding to what's next. Let's start with the middle one, and it is that the Supreme Court is going to discuss Israel's reasonableness law on September 12th. Now, how does this come to be? Because the Supreme Court in Israel is not active, it's reactive. Someone has to file a complaint for the Supreme Court to interfere, just like here in the US. And we had 8 petitions filled with rapid successions of fallen people, and also several complaints, both from opposition leaders and protest leaders, both saying that this now has to go to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not the reasonableness bill should be passed or not. Now, legally, the Supreme Court has the ability to overrule a decision made by the Knesset. It is. But because the reasonableness bill is part of the basic law of the judiciary reform, Supreme Courts never interfered in the past with the basic law. It's because basic law is considered in Israel kind of like a comprised constitution. We've talked about that plainly as well in past sessions. And if we want to broaden that one, we can definitely do it in the next session. I know the JCRC just did that. I know they brought Susan Avot, which is a brilliant professor for legal studies, and she gave a lot of explanation about this. So we have an unprecedented decision coming up, which is whether or not the Supreme Court will overrule a decision made by the Knesset, not just a regular decision, not just a regular law, but a basic law. Now, because of this being such a unique and remarkable event, for the first time ever, the Supreme Court is gathering all the Supreme judges to discuss this case. All 15 of them will be part of the discussion regarding what to do with the reasonableness bill. They set the date for September 12th, which is very, very close by in Supreme Court's terms. This is a month and a half from now. This is unprecedented as well. Those type of decisions, those type of discussion usually take ages to enroll because of the pressure the Supreme Courts have, because of the many cases that it involved with, and because of the fact that this takes all Supreme judges. But they know that they need to be rapid with this one. They know they have to move fast. And that's why we're going to see these discussions taking place in September, with now obviously both sides are preparing for this one. Now, here's an interesting conflict for this one. The legal advisor of the Knesset, which performs as an actor within the defense line of the government eventually, was against the reform, was against passing the reasonableness bill, which means that the structural inherent defense line of the state is against it. So what's probably going to happen is that the government is going to pay private lawyers, private defense to represent its case against court without the inherent defense of the Israeli government either being present in the discussion or being present and going to be against it. This is very, very complicated, and it means Israel is going to pay private defense and not using its inherent defense in a case with the Supreme Court. This is going to be a very, very interesting involvement to this one. Now, this is not the first time this have happened. It only happened in several cases, but this definitely puts another aspect to this discussion, in which is even the legal forces within the Israeli government are against the passing of the reasonableness bill, at least in its current form. But this is definitely going to be an interesting development to follow. Now, this is regarding to the reasonableness bill itself, and what's the next step for this one. Regarding the government in its um, current structure, whether or not this will hold or not, that's another debate that is taking place. For the past week, and now I'm referring to the headline from the Times of Israel. According to a lot of headlines came in from the past week, both members of the Likud, the members of um, camp by Benny Gantz, and there's a future by Yair Lapid, calling for a unity coalition, therefore enrolling out the Haredi and the religious Zionism and forming a government that comprised of the Likud, Yesh Atid, and Benny Gantz camp. This one very quickly was overruled both by the opposition and coalition leaders. There is a lot, apart from the whole political structure that we're now leading it, with the Yair Lapid being the leader of the opposition. And just to recollect, 2 years ago, when Blue and White Party was running for elections and won as the biggest party, they eventually broke apart back to Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, because Benny Gantz established a coalition with Netanyahu. The former unity coalition we've seen that was so bad that it didn't last passing the budget. It was so bad that certain laws, certain basic laws were changed in order to pass what is now we refer to as a two-headed coalition, because there was zero trust between the different sides there, Benny Gantz and Netanyahu, that they had to back everything with contracts and bills just to make sure that this coalition will rule, with eventually the lack of trust being what broke apart without the passing of the budget. So seeing a new calls for a unity coalition, specifically when the Likud and Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid are involved, is very unlikely, not just because of the political structuring and the fact that they gain big support from the public as being opposition members, but also because there's zero trust between Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, and Netanyahu. And therefore, whether or not there will be a unity coalition, to me, this seems very unlikely. But as I've said in past sessions as well, you can never try and assume what will happen in Israel, because it will always be wrong. So there's definitely no way of telling whether or not this will come and take place. But it is very unlikely to see a change within the government. Now, regarding to next step within the judicial reform, right? The initial phase was trying to pass everything all at once. That was the first seat of the Knesset in the first few months of this government. They tried to pass the judicial reform as a whole, following a lot of different steps that are made to minimize the effect of the Supreme Courts and the ability of the Supreme Court to oversee the work of the government and the work of the Knesset, not just with the reasonableness bill, but also disabling the ability of the Supreme Court to interfere with basic laws, to create an overruling step for the Knesset to overrule a decision made by the Supreme Courts, changing the structure of the judges' election committee, a lot of them. Once they realized that they cannot pass the whole thing because it would create huge backlash from the public, they tried to pass it once, each one at a time, calling it the bologna or the salami method, and that's why we're seeing the reasonableness bill. Now, I wanted to take a very insensitive, and I'll say even stupid tweet made by Ben-Gvir, one of the most radical right-wing members of the coalition, while he tweeted, "The salad bar is open," a day before the election, the reasonableness bill was passed. Now, this definitely means that they're not going to stop there. They're not going to stop with just a reasonableness bill. This is definitely going to continue, and there will be more changes for the relationship between the Supreme Courts and the government if it's up to this coalition. But from a different perspective, we've seen a lot of coalition members, a lot of more mediate coalition members saying that this is as far as they're willing to go, whether it's Gallant, who is the Minister of Security, and other members of the Likud. Whether or not there will be more laws produced by the government regarding to the judicial reform, only time will tell. I know that there's a lot of the bills already set on the Knesset tables, waiting for discussions, waiting for to proceed within the legislative process. But at the moment, there seems to be voices coming from both sides of the coalition, either to withhold with the reform and not go any further, or at least not go any further without broader agreement, and other members of the coalition pushing for a one-side legislation of the whole thing. This is obviously causing more stress, a lot of tension as well. And whether or not the coalition withhold, that's another thing. Of course, each one of the coalition members has a different aspect that is the most crucial for them when regarding the reform. But I don't know. Honestly, trying to estimate whether or not this is likely or unlikely, I don't know what will happen next regarding to the legislation. We now are in the break of the summer break for the Knesset, which means they'll only get back to legislating on September. And until then, there's plenty of time to legislate and to discuss and to create mediation and maybe argue with other, include other aspects of the Israeli political system forming a larger agreement, or they could be just promoting one side legislation and moving forward with this reform. And there's no way to tell what will happen. We'll just have to follow up with the news. We'll just have to keep up with everything that's happening. I will definitely keep covering everything that's happening and see what will happen next.
Yeah, I just want to know, frequently you refer to the will of the people. For the many, many days, or maybe even months now, that the people have been rising up visually on the press and through the papers, are they effective? Because they're stating their piece, and are they a large majority of the population? Can they be effective?
This is definitely a politically charged question, because there's two aspects to it, because one of them is, do protests work in general, and the other one is this the majority of people, right? Regarding to does protest works, as someone that works within the civil society field and has experience in that one, I'll advocately say yes. I believe so, and I can give you example of some of them that were more successful. They don't have to be huge, they don't have to be enormous to create the change, but they definitely had to put pressure on the people in charge. They have to create a public discussion and a public discourse regarding what's happening and to get people involved. Now, whether or not this had worked, I would argue that it is, because we've seen such huge pressure and discussion going with all sides regarding to whether or not this is happening. And the fact that we've seen the largest protest in Israel, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets every single week for 30 weeks now, that definitely checked the mark of creating public discourse. Regarding to does it work? Now, is it the majority of people? That is the golden question. That is the golden question that everyone's asking from all sides of scale, right? We have hundreds of thousands of people marching every week, protesting. It, but at the same time, every time that the right decide to put on a protest, 10,000s of people come in. Now, does that mean every single person in Israel go and protest? Not necessarily. There's definitely not going to be a questionnaire going out from the government to people asking for their opinion.
So that they're going to discuss, the High Court is going to discuss this on September the 12th, to me is an indication that there has been some sort of consideration due to this protest, that this is not good for, not everybody likes what's happening and they want to try and discuss it.
There's definitely you can definitely see that not just because of the Supreme Courts, but because of the fact that every single politician is addressing the protest, whether calling them a very few anarchistic extremists or the person called them the majority of people. Both of them acknowledge the fact that there is a big disagreement with the public regarding to what's happening. Supreme Courts interfere with decisions that made by the Knesset and governments in many cases, dozens of cases. The Supreme Court has been interfering in the past, and it is because someone is filing a complaint, and the Supreme Court has to rule regarding that complaint. It's going to ask the state to represent their sides, and those who are the prosecution, those who wants to vote against it, are going to present their sides, and then the Supreme Court will have to rule whether or not to interfere initially, and if do interfere, to rule in what favor. Regarding the fact that whether or not the majority of people is opposing it does not necessarily affect the Supreme Court's going to interfere with the decision, but the fact that a lot of people has complained to court, there's 5 complaints. In several, so this touches even a bigger issues that it is part of what we're seeing in Israel. And I have no idea how to pronounce that in English. It's the judicialization of the political system. I think I've pronounced it correctly. I might be wrong, like 80% wrong. But what it essentially means is that a lot of the public discourse, a lot of the main conflicts that we're facing were moved forward from the halls of the Knesset, the whole of the legislature, and from the decision of the people's representatives to Supreme Court's complaints with many, many cases. And a lot of people claim that it's even too many cases. And therefore, it is also followed by a lot of legislation that limits the Knesset power as a structure and gives more power to the government. So the only equal in power to the government right now is the Supreme Court. In creating that balance with only the 2 of them, right, fighting each other and creating stress from both sides is also one of the main reasons for this whole conflict. It is the fact that a lot of people are saying that the Supreme Court is more interfering than ever regarding to matters of the Knesset, and that it does not have an inherent advantage regarding to certain subjects. When looking at representative, by saying there's no inherent advantage for Supreme Court's judge than to someone elected by the public. And if that's the case, why should they interfere? Why should they have the overruling ability, right? This is part of this discussion. By the way, some of it I agree with. I think that there's a lot of cases when the Supreme Court's interfere and shouldn't have been interfering with, because it eventually promotes this growing tension that now we see between the Supreme Courts and the Knesset, where a lot of the stuff were meant to remain by the Knesset. I also think that lack of leadership and lack of agreement between the representatives of our public in the past 20 years have caused this, because there's no vacuum, and when there is a lack of decision, someone else will make it. That's part of the reasons that we see this bipolar relationship between the 2 institutions is the way it is. And therefore, trying to refer to the fact that there is definitely a need in change. And if we look at the JCRC webinar that they just did, Professor Suzy Navar talked about a constitutional court, which is something that is really interesting and might just be what works in Israel. Another institution that its job is to be representative, to be democratic, to be voted by the public, and also has the ability to overrule decisions made by the government. Therefore, creating a new triangle imbalance and not just a bipolar balance, which is the way we'll look at the Israeli political system now.
Dean,
Yes.
can you comment? I understand the dichotomy that you're describing institutionally, but isn't there something to be said that there isn't enough debate within the parties in the Knesset and divert so that there's it seems to be a system that's driven by party leaders that the lists have to follow, rather than what you see, even in the United States still in Congress, people with different views, they converse with each other. They have to compromise, taking some of the edge. If there was more of that, it would take the edge off the fight with the Supreme Court, or no?
That's a good. I mean, there's a lot to talk about this, right? When we're talking about the tension between those two institutions. But again, as I said, past legislation in the past like 20 years have decreasingly reducing the size of and the ability of the Knesset to interfere with legislation of the coalition, right? Because the coalition, the government, is the majority of the Knesset in Israel, which means that they have full control. In the past, it was much, much easier to create private initiatives and private legislation that has been reduced in power through several mechanisms that were invented in order to increase the power of the coalition and reduce the power of the opposition. This is one aspect of it. Other aspect also includes the way that they treat members, right, of the coalition. And this is also maybe even like Darwinism of the political system, where rogue politicians eventually were eliminated from the political system in general, because they didn't get any side on the other side, because they were considered traitors. And to the people who voted for them, they will never vote for them again. So we're reducing the ability of rogue, kind of like political system. So with complete loyalty to your party, on the other hand, and reduced size of the opposition, on the other hand, creates that vacuum, right? Of whenever there is a conflict, it's much more difficult to create a mediation process, right? And that's where the Supreme Court was interfering. The idea of a constitutional court didn't came by like the last year. This is something that Israel has been talking about for ages, but it does require one big thing, which is a constitution for a constitutional court to exist. But it is part of a larger process, which is Israel is still a country in the making. We're not done yet. It's not over. We're not even reaching 100 years. Who knows what will happen in 100 years? But the battle we're seeing right now, it is part of a larger, ongoing phase, which is I believe, which is eventually the making of a constitution and the making of a constitutional court.
Dean, I have a question about the constitutional court. It sounded as though the assumption was the constitutional court would be elected. And so if it's elected at the same time as the Knesset, it seems that it would be likely to reflect the constitution of the Knesset. And so it's not clear that would be any check at all.
That's a great comment. There's many, many different arguments that you have to take in and a lot of consideration in order to really form this thing. There's a lot of theories regarding to what this constitutional court has to eventually look like, whether it's elected by the public, or does it elect differently than the Knesset in other times, the same as the Senate with the Congress, and the fact that the change in time also might inflict a change in public opinion. There's a lot to it. We're not even yet remotely close to a constitution, nonetheless a constitutional court, but it is definitely a solution that a lot of people are talking about right now regarding this tension, because both sides has a point. The Supreme Court has a lot of abilities to interfere with the work of the government. Some of it is just, some of it is not just, but if it's not the Supreme Court right now, then there's no one else. And this is part of the larger argument. And thinking about how can this resolve on an institutional basis might eventually lead to a much thicker and more stable structure for the Israeli democracy. Because at the moment, and we've talked about this one in the past as well, the structure can be changed in any simple vote with a majority of 1 to 0, because there's no basic law that specifies or specialize the state of the basic laws. So any law, whether it's the basic law of the police, the basic law of elections, the basic law of the government, the basic law of the judicial system, can't be changed by a majority of 1-0. And this is a problem. This is a problem, and this is part of this larger agreement, which I hope, when we're talking about broader agreement, if we're also going to limit the power of the Supreme Court, this might be a good limitation for the government itself, saying it needs a really big majority in order to change a basic law. And obviously civil rights, but that's another discussion. Yes.
So
You're the only one polite enough to raise your hand, by the way,
I'm
every time you
sorry.
ask a question. You don't have to
Yeah.
do that. You can just
I'm
break
always
free.
gonna hesitate to say something stupid, but I'm just curious to know, will that affect a term limit for Netanyahu, for example? I mean, is there any way to, oh, I like that. Yeah, I'm so with you there. I mean,
Not just
it
for
doesn't
Netanyahu,
seem
but the
right.
term limit. Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't seem right to have democracy with the same person always in control, no matter, I mean, like, I don't know, it just.
So I support term limitation, definitely, but we don't see a lot of precedents for term limitations when regarding parliamentarian democracies. It is more complicated because we're not electing a single person, we're electing a party. And if he wins both the primary and the general election, there seems to be a lot of people that are promoting into power, then there might be a reason behind that. And also the fact that Israeli political system is involved around creating a coalition, which going to make it even harder for this one to exist. There are arguments on both sides regarding to term limitation. I believe the general basic statement, which is power corrupts. And if that's the case, then you definitely made a limitation on terms. But it doesn't necessarily will be the same as the one here in the US. Different systems, different values considered each elections and the election process itself. There has to be some limit. I'm not sure that term limitation is the right limit for this one. But again, this is a much more deep kind of like philosophical state science type of discussions that I'm really into, and I encourage you to be involved with too. And I would love to talk about you. But at the moment, what we're seeing is a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, and a lot of pressure for some form of a result. If that covers that. Now, I do want to continue because I wanted to talk about two very big things as well that happened. And I want to also be respectful for your time. So to those who want to pass the hour that we have and stay a few minutes longer, that will be wonderful. For those who are not, you are more than welcome to just say goodbye and finish off today's discussion. This is completely up to you, but I definitely want to reach those points because I think there's much more interesting things that happen, not just a reasonable bill. Another very interesting thing that happened this week and had some advancements in the past few days is the relationship and the procedure of going towards normalization between Israel, America, and Saudi Arabia. Now, this is a very, very interesting topics, and I really encourage you to go deeper into this one. Now, as we recall, the Abraham Accords between Israel and certain Arabic states, the United States is one of them, Morocco recently was another one, and Sudan may be in the process as well, all creates a very interesting and advancing relationship between Israel and Arabic states that does not align definitely with the relationship with the Palestinians. There has been a conception all throughout Israel's existence until the past few years that there cannot be an agreement without the Palestinians being involved. With the Abraham Accords being an unprecedented one, enabling that connection that obviously creates a lot of collaborations and shared initiatives between United Emirates and Israel that was very, very beneficial for both sides. There's obviously a lot of arguments regarding to whether or not you should interfere with the state that is not democratic, and obviously the United Emirates is not the perfect place, definitely, nor does Israel. It is definitely not a democracy. It is definitely not a liberal country. but it is an advancement regarding to relationship with Arabic states. And now there is a discussion to try and move forwards with one of the largest one in the world, the largest exporter of oil in the world, which is Saudi Arabia. And it is very interested with the relationship in Israel. But also Saudi Arabia, as a leader of the Arab world, is much more involved with the Palestinians as well. Now, again, we're seeing kind of like a triangle of relationship between Israel, the United States, to try to mediate that relationship, and Saudi Arabia. With now the recent development is that Saudi Arabia's, specifically bin Salman, as the leader of Saudi Arabia, wanting significant concessions, specifically from the Israeli governments, if we're going to talk at all about a agreement between the two of them. Not just from Israel, concessions also from Americans regarding a local treaty, regarding business with weapon industries, even creating some form of a security alliance between the two of them regarding attacks coming from both Washington or Saudi Arabia to protect each other, similar to NATO. There is a lot in stake right now within that conversation, but it also obviously affects Israel very much. The Saudi Arabia, at least at the moment, said that as part of their concessions, they want a promise from the Israeli government that they will not annex any part of the West Bank in the upcoming something years. They might want to ask for a lot of concessions regarding to building and sea territories in Judea and Samaria. There is definitely a lot that is going to be more challenging than ever because of the right-wing government we have right now with Netanyahu, which puts a lot more pressure on the government. And right now, we don't see any advancement regarding to this discussion, just because of the fact that significant concessions align completely sideways from this coalition's advancements. So this one is definitely an interesting to follow up. And of course, I was trying to be varied and diverse with the articles itself. So I like the headlines and how different they are, covered by the Israel Today, the Jerusalem Post, and the Times of Israel. Obviously, there's so much more news and medias that cover it, but this one I found interesting. And you can actually see the agenda changes from headline to another. But the fact that in difference from the other Arab countries within the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia does align an agreement with concessions to the Palestinians, tells a lot about both the relationship that the Arabic world has, specifically the Sunni Arabic world, not necessarily referring to Iran and the Shia, but definitely the Sunni world, the one that is in relationship with the Western world. This is definitely something to look for. Yes, Gabriel. Yes, Gabe.
I'm curious. The right-hand headline says fast train to peace or a trap, but it doesn't. What's there? The head and the subhead don't explain what the trap might be with the deal.
So this could be definitely a trap in terms of if Israel disagree to give any concessions, then Israel could be perceived as don't want to align anything to do with Saudi Arabia and can be used to put pressure from other Arab countries to then decline future relationship with Israel by saying they're not willing to give in anything, right? This definitely could be a trap, but this is an analysis. This is an opinion made by the specific one is saying good enough? Couldn't? I don't know. But it's from the Israel Today media. There's definitely a lot to it, right? This is not an easy relationship to have, especially because Saudi Arabia is one of the leading forces in the Arabic world. They have a lot of pressure put upon themselves as well. And if they go to an agreement with Israel, probably other Arab countries would follow. And if Saudi Arabia decide that it don't want anything to do with Israel, then other Arab countries would follow. This puts much more pressure than just Saudi Arabia itself on the relationship. Obviously, putting a pressure on the US as well, willing to have this alliance and treaties being held puts a lot of pressure on the US as well. But obviously for the US as well, leading this type of connection might be followed by other Western countries to want to be involved as well. So there's a lot to it. There's definitely a lot to it than just the relationship with Israel, but also about the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And this definitely is an interesting one to follow and see how does this develops.
Dean, I'm sorry to ask, I can't
Go for it.
operate my site, but a question. What's
Yes.
the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Palestinians? It
So-
seems to me the pressure is only on Israel to do this, and that. But what about the Palestinians? What's the pressure on Palestinians to do this and that? To make this peace agreement work with Saudi Arabia? What are they doing with the Palestinians?
So your question is about what is the relationship right now? What is the pressure that is being put upon Palestinians for this agreement?
Yes,
Which one is it?
first one.
First one. The relationship right now is that Saudi Arabia supports Palestinians financially and globally. There's a lot of Palestinians, refugees in Saudi Arabia. There's huge relationship between the Saudi Arabia and the PA, the Palestinian Authority. And there's always been a pressure from Saudi Arabia for some form of concession with Palestinians when regarding Israel. This is not the first we're hearing about it, but it's the first time that it is part of an agreement between Israel and another country with Saudi Arabia. There's always been a relationship between of them. Now, regarding pressure on Palestinians, when talking about this one, the fact that Palestinians are not part of this team, US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, tells you what is the pressure that should be or should not be frowned upon. This is a very interesting question, but it is complicated. And there's always been a relationship and support from Saudi Arabia to the Palestinians, not just as leaders of the Arab world, but also financially, there's a connection between them. Does that cover your question?
Well, it does cover some of it, but we'll pursue it some other day.
Brilliant. Right. I do want to make it through the two other subjects that I wanted to discuss with. And one more interesting thing is protests in Gaza, not against Israel, but actually against Hamas. This is a really interesting development that we've seen in Gaza. Now, just to recollect what is happening in Gaza, because it is very different than what's happening in the West Bank. Gaza, right now, is not under any possession of country. It is not part of Israel, and it is not part of Egypt. It is its own land without sovereignty. There's no armed forces of Israeli army in Gaza, and there's no armed forces of Egypt in Gaza. But differently from the West Bank, which has an army ruling of Israel to some parts of it, but also a Jordanian law to other parts of it. This is what's happening in the West Bank. And also monitoring of the PA, the Palestinian Authority. In Gaza, there is no such thing. So at the moment, the leading authority in Gaza is actually Hamas, a terror organization. There's also the presence of other terror organizations like Jihad and other forms of it. Some of them are supported by Hezbollah, the organization from Lebanon and Syria in the northern part of Israel. Some of it is supported by Iran even as well. Hamas is not one of them. Hamas is a terror organization, but it is different in its relationship with other organizations. Now, the main charges that the protests are going against is the economy collapses in Gaza. And some data that you find interesting is that right now, 45% of people are unemployed in Gaza. Almost half of the people in Gaza don't hold any job. Some of them can come and work in Israel. Very few of them can get a visa to work in Israel. Some of them can get a visa to work in Egypt. Most of them works within Gaza Strip. They don't make a lot. And this is part of Hamas's ruling. Hamas is a terror organization, takes a lot of the humanitarian aid supports that Gaza gets from different organizations, different humanitarian aid organizations, and different Arab countries, and shift that to terror, which means that it doesn't trickle down all the way to the citizens, creating the humanitarian aid that they definitely need. Also perceived as not just as chaos, but as corruption, right? And centralization of the resources by Hamas and making the people suffer. So the protesters are walking down the streets, thousands of protesters. There's more than 1 million people in Gaza. Thousands of protesters, demonstrators rail against Hamas, rail against its corruption. And they're chanting, "What a shame," something that is very familiar to what the protesters in Israel are chanting against the government, which is shame. Now, that raises a much different question, which is, if not Hamas, then what is? Because that is a very, very big question that Israel is struggling with, and I don't think that we're much aware of in the global world. Hamas is a terror organization. Hamas initiate most attacks against cities of the south and general cities in Israel using rockets. Hamas poses a threat to its civilians and citizens and residents of Gaza. Also, by the way, acting against LGBTQ in Gaza, prompting a threat to any liberal value existing there. But at the same time, if it's not Hamas, right? If you take down Hamas, if you revoke every single person in that organization, by the way, most of them are not stationed in Gaza. They're stationed in Turkey, Lebanon, and Qatar. Then what comes next? Well, all of a sudden, liberal democratic structure will emerge and rule Gaza, or just another organization will take its place, performing even more horrors? That is a big question, and it is a question that we're dealing with in Israel every single time. And every time that there was a military operation trying to limit the power of Hamas and other organization in Gaza and withhold them for continuing firing upon cities of the south, we ended up stopping with military forces and not continuing with a statement or a policy to try and create a different structure. And maybe it's not even Israel's job to do that. Maybe because of the tension that we have with Hamas and the tension that we have with the residents of Gaza, by the way, not necessarily the same thing as we're seeing right now, maybe it's not supposed to be Israel to create this autonomous regime eventually that will promote democratic values within Gaza. That's a big question. And if not Hamas, then what is a question that we might have to face not far from now. But at the moment, they do seem to strive for better conditions for themselves, because eventually, as we're seeing for most cases, people don't care about ruling, they don't care about autonomy, they don't care about regimes, they care about providing dinners for their family and working the next day. And if that's the case in Gaza as well, then who knows what's happening.
A question related to Gaza. Are the million residents of Gaza basically stateless people? You said that it's not a formal country. It's not part of its two neighbors, Israel or Egypt. So those people have no passports. They're not citizens of any place. They're just residents of Gaza, but not citizens in terms of the rest of the world. So there's nowhere they can go.
It's a bit more difficult because a similar point that was made to it was the recent development within the agreement between Israel and the US for removing the need of visas to enter, which, by the way, part of the US agreement is also to enable visas for Palestinians and residents of Gaza. There are a few hundreds of Gaza residents that holds a US visa. They are US citizens as well. And what that relationship should be, right? It is a big question. But at the moment, they cannot enter Israel. Only a few of them can enter Israel for work visas alone. If they want to fly out of the country, they will have to go through Egypt. That does not require visas, but they are not Egyptian as well. The Egypt state don't want to be involved with what's happening in Gaza because of how problematic that is, not just Israel.
But they would need a passport to get into another country. If they fly out, when they show up at immigration, US or anywhere, they have to show a passport as an identity proof.
They have documents as Gaza residents, but yes, they are not citizens. Some of them are those who hold foreign passports, just like the US one, and there's a few more. But yes, it's a difficult situation, and most of them are too poor to get out of Gaza. But at the moment, the same way that they are in this very, very bad situation, Hamas is not making easier for them by prompting attacks on Israel, right? So it's a very, very complicated situation.
Can they get to the West Bank? Is there any way that they can? I guess they'd have to go through Israel, but could they get to the West Bank? Since
Egypt,
that's Palestinian territory too.
through Egypt, they come.
Uh,
As I was saying, the passage between Gaza and Egypt is much more open than the one in Israel. So they can pass through Egypt, Jordan to reach West Bank. But again, yes, this is a very, very difficult situation for Gaza residents. It's a difficult situation for the citizens of Israel. That this is how I grew up. I grew up in Beersheba, city in the south of Israel, and all my childhood was followed by rockets fired from Gaza. Right? Hamas is definitely the one to blame for it. But if not Hamas, what could be worse, right? If the jihad raises and the jihad is supported by Iran, will they make it even worse or they make it better? Those are hard questions. But yes, this is the difficult truth, which is people are unfortunate on both sides right now.
I can't remember, how did Gaza end up with that strange status as not being part of any country? I don't remember that. Does that go back to when Israel was founded?
So when Israel was founded, Gaza was part of Israel the same way that the West Bank was. So it was a difficult territory, but until the early 2000s, Israel had an army, a military rule in Gaza. And in 2000, I don't recall the exact year, but as part of the annexation protocol in Israel, Israel withdraw all of its troops, also evacuating a lot of Jewish settlements that were in Gaza towards Egypt as well, in order to create this strip of land that we're now seeing as Gaza without any Jewish presence in it because of how many terror attacks were happening. But this
So
was a
Israel
one-sided deal.
basically, just Israel basically abandoned it, divorced it, and left it alone.
Essentially, yes. It was a right-wing government led by Ariel Sharon, supported by the Likud as well, that decided that the one side parting, because they didn't want the military and armed forces to deal with the ongoing attacks from terror organizations already present in Gaza, to continue and waste security lives in the matter, also risking the population that was living within this lines of sight. Israel eventually said, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. Withdraw all the troops, evacuate all the different settlements that were there, and just let the residents of Gaza take control of Gaza, which eventually led to the rise of the organization. There are a lot of criticism coming in from the public saying that this was a wrong thing to do because now we created something that's even worse. But it is what happened. And it is the unfortunate truth and the unfortunate reality that we now have to live with. Right. And as every session does, I didn't want to end up with only bad stuff happening and serious stuff. So, obviously, and I keep bringing this up every single session that we do, Golden Movie is coming out August 23rd, August 25th. Is supposed to be a really good one. Really excited about it. One more thing, and I found this one really interesting. Act News, which is a new tool, has initiated an AI-powered news broadcasts, taking Amit Segal and Miri Michaeli, two very famous Israeli journalists, and creating an AI version of them that will prompt the news and broadcast it on TikTok and Instagram-based media. I found this one to be remarkable and also deeply troubling, say the least.
What I would like is a promise that Israel will never send a robotic Shaliach to the JCC, and these will always be real human beings.
I'll promise that I don't use an AI for myself for the upcoming 2 years that I have here.
But now there's even more reason that sooner or later I have to meet you in person to make sure that you're not an AI.
You're more than welcome. I would love that. But this is very interesting. I mean, to see how this one develops, and also deeply troubling, causing huge issues of ethics and rights, and I mean, there's so many issues to dive into regarding this one. But those two have consent to have an AI avatar generated for them to broadcast the news without them being present.
And who is sponsoring that AI? Who is doing that AI? Who's broadcasting?
So this one is ACT News. This is the media company that does that. It's part of a larger initiative that they do. It's an Israeli-based initiative. We're prompting fast, rapid, coming news that will present an AI broadcaster just in order to be that rapid, right? You don't have to have a, to reduce the costs and the time takes to create this type of broadcasts and do it with the AI.
Well, you know that the use of AI is one of the issues that's causing the writers and actors strike, where especially the actors don't want their images captured the way these people's have been and then used forever without any further payments. And, so seeing what these people have agreed to do is a little bit alarming, considering the issues that the actors here are now protesting.
Like everything in Israel, everything that's happened here, we'll experience that in 10 years from now. So maybe in 2033, you will see a protest coming from news broadcasters saying that their rights as writers and actors are now need to be invoked. And with that, I want to wish you all a more happier week than the one that we just covered. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Dean.
The next one.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. My first time here. Thank you.
Welcome, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.